Don't ignore these common signs of stress in your pepper plants. If your plants are constantly stressed out, they won't be as productive as they could be. So in this video, I'll share several different types of stress that you should never ignore and what you can do to fix them. Jumping right in, the first sign of stress you should never ignore in your peppers is yellowing leaves. Now, I will say that 1 or 2 random yellow leaves on your pepper plants is completely normal. It's just a sign of natural aging. Older leaves, usually those lower down or somewhere in the middle of the plant, sometimes will die off, turn yellow, and fall off. But where it becomes more concerning is if you notice yellowing lower down on the plant that is spreading and moving upwards over time, spreading to more and more leaves. That is usually a sign of a nutrient deficiency, most likely nitrogen. Basically, what this means is you need to fertilize your plants or otherwise provide nitrogen for the plant to get back on track. And ideally, you'll do this with a liquid or water-soluble fertilizer so that it's instantly available to the plant. With potted plants, it's essential to be fertilizing with every other watering or even more often than that to make sure that the nitrogen the plants need is always there. And even in-ground plants are going to need a supplemental fertilizer throughout the season to make sure they don't start to go pale. One more thing to keep in mind here is overwatering or even a heavy rainfall can wash nitrogen right out of the soil. This is especially important for growing in containers, or if you have sandy soil, the nitrogen is much more likely to leach out in these cases. So after a downpour or heavy watering, you may want to replenish the nutrients in the soil. Before I get to the next sign of stress you should never ignore with your peppers, if you want to grow healthy, beautiful pepper plants every year, we have an ebook, Growing Perfect Peppers, where we detail our entire process of growing from seed to harvest, just like this plant here. It has detailed pictures and instructions, so if you're interested, I'll leave a link to that down in the description. The next sign of stress you shouldn't ignore in your peppers is slow or stunted fruit development. Basically, if your peppers are taking an unusually long time to mature or are never reaching a full size, maybe they're ripening before they reach their full potential, this can be a sign of a nutrient deficiency or that your plant is trying to do too much. This is really common on bigger pepper varieties like bell peppers or poblanos, where some of the fruits may be a lot smaller than you'd like when they start to ripen. One reason this can happen is that plants will sometimes try to produce more peppers than they can actually support. So in the case of bell peppers, we'll sometimes actually remove some of the fruits so that each plant is only trying to produce between 6 and 8 peppers at any given time. If you leave any more than that, the plants may go on to produce those peppers, but they may be smaller overall, so we prefer having large bell peppers so that we can stuff them and use them for their intended purpose, rather than having a bunch of smaller bell peppers if you leave them all on the plant. The other reason this might be happening is a lack of nutrient, and when your plants are going on to produce fruits, potassium actually becomes even more important than nitrogen, so it can help to add some potassium to your fertilizer regimen later in the season when the plants are going from flowering to producing fruits. Most fertilizers contain plenty of potassium, so if you're fertilizing with an all-purpose fertilizer, chances are you don't have to worry about amending with additional potassium, but make sure that whatever fertilizer you're using does contain that potassium, especially later in the season. The next sign of stress you shouldn't ignore with your pepper plants is flowers and fruits falling off of the plant. This is actually very common, and it's most likely caused by higher temperatures. During the midsummer heat, it's very common to see flowers and fruits falling off. Your plants may just look like a bush without any flowers or fruits during this period, and it's purely due to that high temperature. If you live in a very hot place or you're having a particularly hot summer, you can use shade cloth to protect the plants and sort of buffer the temperature around them. It can reduce the temperature around your plants by up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the thickness of the shade cloth you're using. And for potted plants, you can move them to a shadier location, especially in the afternoon when temperatures are peaking during the day. This can make a big difference in that flower drop. If temperature doesn't seem to be the issue here, but you're still seeing flower drop, you may have an issue with nutrients. Again, too much nitrogen with a lack of phosphorus and potassium can lead to lots of leafy growth, but a lack of flowers and fruiting. So make sure that your fertilizer, again, contains that phosphorus and especially potassium. Another sign of stress you should never ignore in peppers, and I've brought this plant over as a prime example, are wilting leaves. These limp, droopy leaves are usually an indication that the plant needs water, although there can be other reasons for wilted leaves which are more serious. But the first thing to check is if your plant needs water. This one, in fact, does need water. It's growing in this container, and when I lift it up, it feels relatively light. That's a good way to check If your potted plants need water, get used to picking up the plants before and after watering, and about an hour or two after watering, those wilted leaves should perk right back up. However, wilted leaves can also be a symptom of overwatering or more likely poor drainage, so it's unlikely to be an issue in your potted peppers because drainage is naturally great. But if you're growing in the ground and you have wilted leaves, watering doesn't solve the problem. You may actually have a drainage issue where you need to improve drainage from your garden. What's usually happening in this case is root rot, where the roots are sitting in waterlogged soil. They start to actually die off and rot, and so the plant is struggling to absorb water and nutrients, and the leaves begin to wilt. Improving drainage in ground is not a quick process. It really takes a number of seasons to get it right, but usually adding compost or even just some form of grit to your soil and working it into the first few inches is a great way to start improving your drainage. One other very serious reason you might be seeing wilted leaves is something called verticillium wilt, which is a fungal pathogen that is soil-borne, and the first symptom is usually part of the plant will start to wilt, whereas other parts of the plants will stay normal. Usually a branch or two will start to wilt and die off, and usually it spreads over time and will kill the plant in the long run. So things you can do, really you want to prevent this to begin with, so mulching around the base of your plant and removing lower foliage to keep those lower leaves out of the soil where that pathogen starts. And if you're certain that you have verticillium wilt on some of your plants, the best bet is to remove those plants from the garden. They're probably not going to make it anyway. And by removing those plants from your garden, you'll ensure that it won't spread to other plants this season, and you can potentially save some of your other peppers from this outcome. Another sign of stress you should never ignore are brown spots on the bottom side of your peppers. This is something that's very common on tomatoes, but it can also affect a variety of different peppers, and it is blossom end rot. Contrary to the name, it's not a true rot. It's actually just calcium not able to reach the bottom of the developing fruits, and so the skin doesn't form properly, usually at the base or the blossom end of the fruits, causing these patches. Now, even though it is calcium related, it usually doesn't mean that you need to be adding calcium to the soil. Usually there's plenty of calcium in ground soil and even potting soil, but instead to adjust your watering regimen so that it's more even and consistent. Mulch is a great option if you've dealt with blossom end rot. It will help prevent water from evaporating out of the soil too quickly and requiring you to come back and water more frequently. And when it comes time to water, I always recommend watering deeply for a long duration, but less frequently. So maybe once a week, coming through and watering for a nice long period of time, percolating that water down deep into the soil and nourishing the entire root system and encouraging that root system to grow larger over time. Essentially, you want to avoid going from periods of extreme drought to overwatering back to super dry. This is what causes that calcium uptake issue. But I will say, in my experience, usually the first 1 or 2 fruits on a pepper plant are more susceptible to blossom end rot, and then the condition usually resolves itself as the plant becomes more established, the root system grows larger and is more resilient to these fluctuations in water. So basically, just try to maintain even soil moisture throughout the season, avoid those overwatering and underwatering cycles, and also as soon as you notice this on a fruit, you can remove it from the plant to free up energy for other fruits to develop. And another sign of stress you should never ignore are brown or black spots on your pepper's leaves. Spotting on your plant is usually a sign of disease, and there are many different diseases that can affect pepper plants depending on the region that you're growing in, and they can come from a variety of sources, from the soil to your actual seeds. Even airborne pathogens can cause viral and fungal infections. I won't get into the specific diseases that can impact peppers just because there are so many and it varies widely, but there are many things you should be doing to prevent any type of disease. First, try to improve air circulation around the plants. If it's stuffy and humid and your plants are all squished together, this is a conducive environment for disease to both develop and spread. So you can trim excess foliage or just move your potted peppers a little bit farther away from one another, and maybe adjust your plant spacing next season. Also, avoid overhead watering. There's really no need to water the leaves, and any existing pathogens will have a much easier time spreading when there's water going from one leaf to another. So just water at the base of the plants where the water is actually needed. If the disease seems to be affecting just part of your plant, you can remove that from the plant to avoid spreading any further to the rest of the plant or to other plants in your garden, and get it far away from your garden, and you can even burn it to get rid of it. And lastly, make a note of the variety of pepper that got the disease in the first place. I've noticed through our years of gardening and growing peppers that some varieties are much more susceptible to disease than others, and sometimes it's just worth removing that plant from the garden entirely and not growing it in future seasons. There are many other things that can go wrong, unfortunately, with your peppers, but hopefully you don't have any of these things to worry about. But if you do see them in the future, I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks so much for watching Pepper Geek, and I'll see you soon.